Cold rain poured down as the German shepherd sat motionless, his fur matted, his eyes empty. Once loved, now abandoned, he didn't flinch, didn't hope. The world had turned its back on him, and he had given up. The rain had no mercy. It fell in endless sheets, pounding against the cracked pavement, pooling in the uneven dips of the road, turning everything into a cold, wet void. And in the middle of it all, the German shepherd sat, motionless. His fur, once thick and noble, clung to his frail frame, drenched and heavy. Each drop that struck his body was just another reminder of his place in this world. Nowhere. His name had once been Max, a name given with love, called out with warmth. It had meant something once. But now, it was just a whisper in the storm, lost like everything else. His body trembled, but it wasn't from the cold. Hunger gnawed at him, deeper than the chill in his bones, but he had long since stopped searching for scraps. His ribs pressed against his skin, each breath a shallow effort. Cars sped past, their headlights slicing through the rain, illuminating his sunken eyes for a fleeting moment before fading into the distance. No one stopped. No one looked. He had once belonged to a home. Not just any home, but a place of warmth, laughter, a world where he had been more than just an afterthought. The hands that had once scratched behind his ears, the voice that had once greeted him every morning, were nothing more than ghosts now. His owner had loved him once, had promised to keep him safe. And then one day, they were gone. It had happened fast. The boxes had appeared first, stacking up against the walls. The house had grown quieter. The usual excitement of a leash being clipped onto his collar had become rare, then non-existent. And then came the ride. A long drive, the scent of damp cardboard filling the car, the window cracked just enough for him to feel the crisp autumn air against his face. He had thought it was an adventure. He had believed, right until the last moment, that he was still wanted. The car door had opened. A hand had reached for his collar. And then, nothing. No goodbyes. No hesitation. Just the slamming of a door and the roar of an engine fading into the distance. He had chased at first, his legs burning, his paws slapping against the pavement. But cars were faster than dogs, and love was faster to disappear than he had ever understood. That had been weeks ago, maybe months. Time had become meaningless. The hunger, the ache in his limbs, the exhaustion, it was all the same now. He had waited at first, believing they would come back for him, that this was just a mistake, but no one ever came. The rain thickened, as if the sky itself mourned him. He closed his eyes, letting the downpour wash over him, willing himself to disappear. Hope was a foolish thing, and Max had none left. The distant hum of the city was a cruel reminder that life went on. Laughter echoed from a nearby cafe, where warmth and comfort lived just beyond the glass. A place where people sat, hands wrapped around steaming cups, sheltered from the storm. They didn't see him. Or maybe they did, but they chose to look away. Max shifted slightly, his legs stiff from hours of stillness. A sharp pain shot through his body, but he barely flinched. He had learned not to react. Moving too much made him noticed, and being noticed was dangerous. The last time he had drawn attention, rough hands had grabbed him, shoving him off a doorstep where he had tried to rest. A boot had caught his side, sending him sprawling onto the pavement. Filthy mutt, get out of here. The words didn't matter. It was the tone, the finality of it. People didn't want him. He had accepted that. Still, there had been moments, fleeting, cruel moments, where kindness had almost fooled him. A woman had knelt once, reaching into her bag, her eyes soft with something he didn't recognize anymore. Hope. She had pulled out a sandwich, her fingers tearing a small piece off before reaching towards him. Then a man's voice had cut through the moment. Don't. You'll just encourage him. Encourage him to what? To exist? To believe, even for a second, that he was still worthy of kindness? She had hesitated, and that was enough. The sandwich never came. Now, as the rain poured harder, Max curled in on himself, his tail wrapped tightly around his body. If he stayed still enough, if he stopped taking up space, maybe the world would forget him. Maybe he would forget himself. And then, for the first time in a long time, something changed. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not like the hurried rush of pedestrians eager to get home. Not like the angry stomps of those who chased him away. These steps stopped, right in front of him. Max lifted his head slightly, just enough to see the figure standing there. A human. Their face was shadowed by the dim glow of a streetlight, their expression unreadable. But their posture held no anger, no malice. They crouched down, a hand extended, not to strike, not to shove him aside, just an open palm, waiting. Max didn't move, didn't trust. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he hesitated. Maybe, just maybe, the world hadn't abandoned him completely. The rain had not let up, and neither had the cold. It clung to the air, seeping into the concrete, wrapping around Max like an unshakable ghost. But now, something was different. Someone had stopped. The figure knelt before him, their hand still extended, palm up, fingers slightly curled, a gesture that spoke without words. It was an offering, a silent promise that no harm would come. Max didn't move, didn't blink. Trust had been beaten out of him, ripped away like everything else. He had learned that hands could be cruel, that kindness was always a fleeting illusion. Yet his body betrayed him. His stomach twisted, a hollow ache gnawing at him, urging him toward the possibility of food. His muscles screamed for rest, for warmth, but he had made a vow to himself, never again. The human remained still, no sudden movements, no impatient huffs or irritated murmurs, just waiting. Then, from a coat pocket, something emerged, small, wrapped in paper, the scent carried over the damp air. Meat, a piece of something rich, something warm, something Max's body craved even as his mind resisted. He swallowed hard, suppressing the instinct that begged him to lunge forward. He had been tricked before. Humans had held out food only to yank it away, laughing as he stumbled. Some had set down scraps laced with bitterness, poison meant to rid the streets of creatures like him. Still, hunger was stronger than fear. Slowly, cautiously, he inched forward, his legs trembling beneath him. His ribs ached from the effort, but he kept his eyes locked on the hand, the meat within it. If it was a trap, he would be ready. The figure did not move, did not retract the offering. Instead, they whispered, their voice barely audible over the rain. "It's okay." The words were foreign, distant, lost in the storm. But something about the tone felt safe. A feeling Max no longer understood, no longer trusted. Still, his nose twitched, pulling in the scent, his mouth watering despite himself. He could not stop his body from moving forward, just enough to reach out, to let his tongue graze the warm surface of the food. And then, nothing. No sudden grip on his scruff, no sharp pain, no cruel laughter, just warmth. He took the meat carefully, expecting it to be yanked away at the last moment. But it wasn't. He chewed, his body desperate to devour, but he forced himself to take his time, still wary, still unsure. The human remained there, unmoving, just watching, not asking anything of him, not expecting. Max had not known what it felt like to be given something without a cost. The rain continued to fall, but for the first time in weeks, he felt something beyond hunger and exhaustion. He felt seen, but trust was not something easily earned. He took a step back, retreating once more into the shadows, the warmth of the food fading too quickly. He expected the human to leave now that they had satisfied their curiosity. That's how it always went. Instead, they reached into their coat again, pulling something else free. A thick blanket, dark and heavy. Slowly, carefully, they draped it over the bench beside him, shielding it from the rain. Then, without another word, they stood. Max tensed, waiting for some kind of trick, some catch that would prove his instincts right. But none came. The human stepped back, turned, and walked away. No demand for affection, no forced attempts to touch him, just leaving the warmth behind. Max stared at the blanket, water dripping from its edges, soaking into the wood beneath it. His instincts told him to ignore it, to move on, to keep the distance that had kept him alive. But the cold pressed harder against his bones, and the rain was relentless. Cautiously, as if the fabric itself might betray him, he stepped forward and curled against it. The warmth was immediate, foreign, and it terrified him. But he did not move away. Not this time. The next day. The storm had passed, but the city remained soaked, puddles reflecting the dull gray sky. The streets were quieter now, the rush of people still hours away. Max stirred, his body stiff, but there was a sliver of warmth beneath him. The blanket. He blinked, adjusting to the morning light, his breath visible in the cold air. And then, the scent. Not just the damp asphalt or the lingering rain, but food. Again. He lifted his head, his ears twitching, searching. The human had returned. They were standing a few feet away, crouched low, another piece of meat in their hand. The same open palm. The same patience. Max hesitated. Last night had been an anomaly, a break in the endless cycle of survival. He had expected the human to forget about him, to move on, like all the others. But they hadn't. Still, caution ran deep in his blood. He eyed them warily, sniffing the air, searching for deceit. None came. His body betrayed him again, that gnawing hunger dragging him forward despite the warnings screaming in his mind. He took a careful step, then another, until he reached the outstretched hand. The scent was intoxicating, warm and rich, and he took the food before his mind could stop him. This time, he didn't retreat as quickly. The human didn't move, didn't try to grab him. Instead, they just sat. Time passed in silence, the city beginning to wake around them. Cars rumbled in the distance, the hum of morning life creeping back in. Max finished the food, licking the last traces from his lips. The human reached out, slower than before. Not toward him, but to the blanket still beneath his tired body. Max stiffened. They paused, waiting. His breath hitched, muscles coiled, ready to flee. But then the human simply adjusted the fabric, tucking it closer around him before pulling their hand away. No force, no demand. Just kindness. Something inside Max cracked, so small, so fragile, that he barely noticed it. The human reached into their pocket again, but this time it wasn't food they pulled free. A collar, worn leather, faded but strong. They set it beside the blanket, letting it rest there, making no move to put it on him. A choice. Max's ears flattened. He knew what collars meant. He had worn one once, back when he belonged to someone, when he mattered. Now he was nothing, a stray, forgotten. Yet the human didn't force it, didn't push. They just sat. Minutes passed, then an hour. Max didn't run. And when the human finally stood, stepping back once more, they only offered a few quiet words before walking away. "I'll be back tomorrow." No pleading, no expectations, just a promise. And as Max watched them disappear down the street, the collar still resting beside him, something inside him whispered what he refused to believe. Maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. The days passed in a blur of cold and hunger, but something had shifted. The human came back. Every morning, without fail, they arrived with food, a warm presence in the otherwise indifferent world. They never pushed, never forced. They just sat, letting Max decide how close he wanted to be. And Max did come closer. At first it was just necessity, hunger driving him to accept the meals. But then it became something else, a quiet ritual, a fragile thread of trust weaving between them. The collar remained untouched beside the blanket. Every day the human left it there, never trying to slip it around Max's neck. It was a silent offer, nothing more. But Max wasn't ready. Not yet. Then, one morning, the human didn't come. Max woke early, his body stiff from the cold, his stomach hollow. He lifted his head, ears pricked, scanning the street. He waited. But the human never arrived. Panic set in slowly. It wasn't immediate. At first, Max simply assumed they were late, but as the hours dragged on, a strange unease curled in his chest. By midday, he could no longer ignore the feeling clawing at his gut. Something was wrong. His instincts screamed at him to stay put, to bury himself in the safety of the blanket and wait. But another part of him, the part that remembered what it was like to belong, refused. With hesitant, trembling legs, Max did something he hadn't done in months. He moved. At first, he wasn't sure where to go. The human had never led him anywhere, never asked him to follow. He only had their scent, faint but familiar, lingering in the spaces they had occupied. So, he followed. The city was loud, unfamiliar. Max had not ventured far beyond his small corner of existence for so long that everything felt overwhelming. The rumble of cars, the voices of people, the sheer vastness of it all, it pressed against him, making him want to turn back. But he didn't. Step by step, he pushed forward, following the faint, familiar scent. Then he found it. A street corner, a small alleyway tucked between two buildings. The smell of the human was strongest here. Max hesitated at the entrance, his ears flattening as he sniffed the air. Then, he saw them. The human was on the ground, slumped against a brick wall. Their coat was torn, their face pale beneath streaks of dirt and dried blood. A shattered cup lay beside them, coins scattered across the pavement. Max's stomach twisted. He didn't understand human cruelty, but he recognized violence. Someone had hurt them. They weren't moving. Max stepped forward, his paws silent against the wet pavement. He nudged their arm gently, then harder, his heart pounding against his ribs. No response. A new kind of panic overtook him, something deeper than hunger, colder than the rain that had soaked through his fur. The human had been his constant, the only thing in this world that had shown him kindness. And now they were broken. Max whimpered, circling them, desperate for a sign of life. Then, a sound. Faint, barely there. A breath. They were alive. But for how long? Max didn't know what to do. He wasn't human. He couldn't speak, couldn't call for help, but he could move. And so he ran. The city blurred around him as he bolted through the streets, his paws slapping against wet pavement. He had no plan, no direction, only the desperate need to find someone who could help. People stared as he rushed past, but no one stopped him. Then, a scent. Something familiar. A place the human had passed before. The scent of metal, of rust, of something sharp and sterile. It clung to the air, just like it had clung to them. A clinic. Max skidded to a stop outside the glass doors, his chest heaving. Inside, humans moved back and forth, their voices a distant hum. He didn't hesitate. With all the strength he had left, he launched himself against the door. It didn't budge. He tried again, claws scraping against the surface, barking. Loud, desperate, a sound he hadn't made in months. A woman inside turned, startled. Her eyes widened at the sight of him. Then, she moved. The door swung open, and Max didn't wait for an invitation. He darted inside, his body trembling, soaked fur dripping onto the tile floor. The woman knelt, reaching out cautiously. "Hey there, buddy. Are you okay?" Max barked again, but this time he turned, darting back toward the door, pausing just long enough to look at her, then back toward the alleyway. She frowned. "What is it?" Another bark, a plea. Understanding flickered in her eyes. "You want me to follow you?" Max whined, shifting on his paws, torn between urgency and the fear that she wouldn't understand. But then, movement. She grabbed her coat, calling to someone in the back. "I think something's wrong. I'll be back." Max didn't wait to see if she was following. He ran. The journey back felt endless, every second stretching into an eternity. He could hear footsteps behind him, but he didn't look back. He just ran, the memory of the human's still form pushing him forward. When he finally reached the alley, the woman gasped. "Oh my God!" She rushed past him, dropping to her knees beside the unconscious human. Max hovered nearby, his body tense, watching as she pressed her fingers to their neck, checking for something. Life, maybe. Then, she pulled out a phone. "We need an ambulance. Now." Max didn't understand the words, but he understood urgency. He whimpered, stepping closer, nudging the human's hand with his nose. It was still cold. Minutes passed. A siren howled in the distance. Then, more humans arrived. A stretcher, hands lifting the human's body. Max growled at first, stepping forward, but the woman from the clinic placed a hand on his back. "They're helping," she murmured. "It's okay." For the first time in as long as he could remember, Max wanted to believe that. The paramedics worked quickly, securing the human onto the stretcher, preparing to load them into the ambulance. Max's heart pounded. Then, the doors swung shut, and they were gone. Max stood there, frozen. He had done everything he could. He had brought help. But now, he was alone again. The woman from the clinic sighed, kneeling beside him. "You did good, buddy." Max barely heard her. His human was gone, and he had no idea if they would ever come back. The city moved on without him. Max stood in the alleyway long after the flashing lights had disappeared, after the last voice had faded into the cold silence of the night. The human was gone, and for the first time since it all began, Max had no idea what to do. The world around him felt different now, emptier. The familiar hum of distant traffic, the scent of wet asphalt, the glow of streetlights, none of it mattered. All that mattered had been taken away, carried off in the back of that metal box with the screaming siren. His stomach ached with hunger, but it was a distant, muted feeling, drowned beneath the crushing weight pressing down on him. It was not like before. Before, hunger had been his only companion, a constant reminder that he had to keep moving, keep surviving. Now it was just there, meaningless. The blanket still lay where he had left it. The collar, too. He had never touched it, never dared to claim it as his own. But now, he nudged it with his nose, staring at the worn leather. A symbol of belonging, a promise that had never been spoken, only offered. But what did it mean, now that the human was gone? Max curled up on the blanket, the scent of them still lingering in the fabric. It was faint, fading with each gust of wind, but it was enough to make his chest tighten. He rested his head on his paws, ears twitching at every distant sound, every footstep that wasn't theirs. They weren't coming back. The thought hit him harder than he expected. He had lost before. Homes, people, the warmth of a place he could call his own. But this was different, because he had chosen this human. And for a brief moment, he had let himself believe they had chosen him, too. A deep, aching whine escaped him, lost in the night air. He stayed in that alley for hours, maybe longer. Time had no meaning. The world blurred into an endless stretch of waiting. And then, something broke inside him. The blanket was no longer warm. The alley was no longer a place of quiet safety. The city, this cruel, empty place, had taken too much from him. He stood, shaking out his fur, his body stiff from the cold. His legs felt weak, but his mind had already made the decision. He would find them. The hospital. The humans had taken them there. He didn't know where it was, didn't know how far, but he knew their scent. He would follow it until his legs gave out, until he collapsed if he had to. He could not stay here. He would not lose them too. So, with one last glance at the alley, the only home he had known in so long, Max turned and walked away. and he didn't look back. The city at night. The streets were different now, no longer a place of survival, but a maze standing between him and the only thing that mattered. His paws ached as they pressed against the cold pavement, his steps slow at first, hesitant. The city was too big, too vast, but he had never cared before. He had never needed to care. Now, every street felt like an impossible distance. Every alley held shadows too deep to risk stepping into. He had spent so long hiding, curling in on himself to stay unnoticed. Now he needed to be seen. He needed someone, anyone, to tell him where they had taken his human. The scent was faint, lost beneath the layers of exhaust, food, and the thousands of strangers who moved through the city like ghosts. But it was there. He followed it through the sidewalks slick with melted ice, through crowds that barely spared him a glance. The scent led him forward, through the marketplace, where the smells of bread and meat almost distracted him, through the park where the trees dripped from the night's earlier storm. But then it faded. He stopped, lifting his nose to the air, desperate to catch even the smallest trace of them. His heart pounded. He couldn't have lost them. Not now. Panic set in, crawling beneath his skin. His breaths came fast, uneven. He turned in circles, searching, looking, and then a sound. Not theirs, not yet, but close. The sharp wail of sirens. Max had heard that sound before, in the moments before they had taken the human away. It had been loud, urgent, pressing against his ears like a warning. A memory flashed through his mind, blue lights reflecting against wet pavement, the human's still form being lifted, hands pressing against their chest. The sirens had come for them. Maybe they would lead him back. His legs moved before he could think, his body surging forward with renewed energy. The streets blurred around him, shapes shifting as he dodged past humans, his claws scraping against the pavement. The closer he got, the stronger the scent became. He wasn't sure how he knew. Maybe it was instinct, maybe something deeper, but he was getting closer. A streetlight flickered ahead, revealing a towering building of glass and steel. The scent of sickness clung to the air, sterile and sharp. People moved in and out, their shoes clicking against the floor, their voices hushed. A hospital. Max slowed, his breath coming fast, his sides heaving. He had made it. But now what? The doors were closed. He had seen humans walk through them, watched as they pushed them open, but he had no hands, no voice to call for help. He stepped forward, his nose brushing against the glass. Inside, the world moved on without him. People rushed past, some carrying papers, others talking in hushed voices. The scent of his human was here, but buried beneath the overwhelming smell of antiseptic and too many other lives moving in too many directions. A low whine escaped his throat. He had come all this way. He couldn't stop now. A woman in scrubs walked past the doors, pausing as she noticed him. Her brow furrowed. She knelt slightly, watching him through the glass. "Hey there, buddy," she murmured, her voice muffled by the barrier between them. Max wagged his tail once. Just once. A silent plea. The woman hesitated. Then slowly, she reached toward something on the wall. A button. The doors slid open with a quiet hiss. Max didn't wait. He rushed inside, ignoring the startled voices, ignoring the hands reaching toward him. He only had one goal. He would find them, no matter what it took. The cold tile was slick beneath Max's paws as he rushed through the hospital's entrance, his breath heavy, his fur dripping with the dampness of the night. He had never been inside a place like this before, where the air smelled too clean, where the hum of machines and the distant murmur of voices filled the silence. But none of it mattered. He had only one purpose. Humans gasped as he ran past them. Someone shouted, "Hey, get that dog out of here!" A pair of shoes squeaked against the floor as someone moved toward him, arms outstretched, but Max dodged them with practiced ease. He had spent too long running, too long knowing when to weave, when to escape. His nose twitched, pulling in every scent around him. The sterile tang of disinfectant, the bitter smell of fear, the fading traces of his human scent, hidden beneath layers of other smells, but still there. He followed it. His claws tapped against the polished floor as he ran, his legs moving faster than they had in days. Hallways stretched before him, long and endless, doors lining both sides, each leading to an unknown place. The scent was stronger now, no longer a whisper, but a clear path cutting through the overwhelming flood of new smells. He turned a corner sharply, nearly crashing into a cart stacked with trays. A nurse yelped, stepping back, her clipboard clattering to the floor. "What the—" Max barely heard her. Ahead, an open doorway. The scent poured from it, washing over him in a wave so strong that his legs almost buckled. He knew this scent. It was them, his human. Max darted inside. The room was dimly lit, the steady beep of a machine filling the quiet space. A bed sat in the center, the sheets a stark white against the dull gray walls. And there, lying motionless beneath those covers, was the human. Max skidded to a stop beside the bed, his chest heaving, his heart hammering against his ribs. They were still. Too still. His stomach twisted. He had come all this way, had followed every trace of them through the city. But what if he was too late? A whimper escaped him as he nudged their hand with his nose, a soft, desperate push against cold skin. No response. His ears flattened, panic rising in his throat. He tried again, pressing his nose against their wrist, licking gently, his tail lowering as fear clawed at him. Still, nothing. Number. They couldn't be gone. Not after everything. Max let out a low, keening whine, his body pressing against the bed. He had lost before. Homes, people, everything he had once trusted. But this human, this one had been different. They had seen him, truly seen him. And now, they weren't moving. A tear slipped down his fur-covered face, though he didn't understand what it meant. He only knew the ache in his chest, the unbearable weight pressing down on him, suffocating him. Then, a movement. Fingers twitching, a slow inhale, shaky, uneven. Max froze, his breath catching. Then, a whisper. Weak, barely there. "Hey, buddy." His whole body jerked forward at the sound. The human's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, before locking onto him. A small, exhausted smile ghosted across their face, their fingers barely managing to lift off the blanket. Max let out a sound, half whimper, half sob, and pressed his head against their hand, the warmth of their touch so faint, so fragile. But they were alive, and he had found them. The human's fingers brushed weakly against Max's fur, their breath slow, unsteady. Max didn't understand the wires, the machines, the strange hum of the room, but he understood this. He understood the warmth of their hand, the way they exhaled his name like a sigh. He had found them. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, growing louder. A voice, sharp, urgent, called out, "There's a dog in here!" Max's ears flattened. He had broken every rule to get here, had pushed past every barrier, but now they would take him away. He could feel it. "Wait," the human murmured, their voice barely audible. The footsteps hesitated. A figure stepped into the doorway. A woman in a white coat, her expression caught between surprise and confusion. Max didn't move. He couldn't. Not when he had just gotten here. The human tried to shift, their body too weak for anything more than a slight movement. "It's okay," they whispered. He's mine." The woman's eyebrows lifted. "Yours?" A pause. The human's fingers curled slightly into Max's fur. Their grip was weak, barely there, but it was enough. "Yeah," they rasped. "He's my dog." The words settled into the air like something final, something real. Max had never belonged to anyone, not since the day he had been abandoned, left in the rain to fend for himself. But now, the human had claimed him, not as a stray, not as something to be pitied, but as theirs. The woman hesitated for only a moment longer before sighing, her gaze softening. "All right," she said, stepping fully into the room. "But he can't stay here." The human's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smirk. "Then I guess you'll have to let me go home?" The woman sighed, shaking her head. "You're impossible." Max didn't understand the exchange, but he understood one thing. He wasn't going to be left behind. The next few days blurred together in a haze of soft voices and quiet movements. The human was still weak, still recovering, but every time Max stirred, they were there. Their hand resting gently against his fur. Their voice, hoarse, tired, but steady, murmuring words he couldn't understand but felt deep in his bones. "You really found me, huh?" Max closed his eyes, pressing his nose against their wrist. Yeah, he had. The day they left the hospital, the world felt different. Brighter, warmer, despite the lingering chill in the air. Max walked beside the human, their steps slow but steady. He could feel the exhaustion radiating off them, but they were moving. That was enough. They stopped just outside the entrance, the wind ruffling through Max's fur. The human exhaled, staring at the world beyond the hospital doors like they weren't sure what to do with it. Then, they looked down at Max, their gaze soft. "You coming with me?" Max blinked. Then, without hesitation, he stepped forward. The human smiled. "Yeah," they murmured, scratching lightly behind his ear. "I thought so." Max let out a small, contented huff, his tail wagging once, just enough to show that for the first time in a long time, he had made his choice, and he was exactly where he was meant to be. The world outside the hospital doors felt different. The air was crisp, but it no longer carried the sharp bite of loneliness. The city still moved as it always had, cars speeding by, people rushing past without sparing a glance, but none of it mattered. Because for the first time in so long, Max was not alone. The human shifted beside him, adjusting the bag slung over their shoulder. Their movements were slow, deliberate, still marked by exhaustion, but they were here. Alive. Walking beside him. Max glanced up at them, his ears twitching as he studied their face. Their skin was still pale, their eyes rimmed with shadows of exhaustion, but there was something else now, something lighter, softer. Freedom. The human sighed, glancing down at him. "We should probably figure out where we're going, huh?" Max didn't understand the words, but he understood the way they were spoken. Half a joke, half a thought not yet fully formed. The kind of words that carried uncertainty, but also the promise of something more. A future. They took a step forward, then another. Max followed without hesitation, falling into step beside them. It felt natural, like he had always belonged at their side, like maybe he always had. They didn't go far at first. The human wasn't strong enough for long walks yet, and Max knew the signs of exhaustion well. He had learned long ago how to read the slow, dragging steps, the way breath became heavier, how the body sagged just slightly under unseen weight. They needed rest. Max slowed his pace, nudging against their leg lightly. The human chuckled, shaking their head. "You're just gonna herd me now, huh?" But they didn't argue. Instead, they stopped in front of a small cafe, the kind with fogged-up windows and the scent of fresh bread curling out from beneath the door. "All right," the human murmured, more to themselves than to him. "I guess we could sit for a bit." They stepped inside, and Max hesitated at the threshold. He had never been allowed inside places like this before. He had spent too long being chased off, too long learning that warm spaces were for others, not for dogs like him. The human turned, glancing back at him. Their eyes softened. "Come on, buddy. You're with me." And just like that, it was enough. Max stepped forward, his paws pressing against smooth tile instead of cold pavement. No one stopped him. No one yelled. He simply followed the human to a corner table where they sat with a heavy sigh, running a hand through their hair. Max settled beside them, curling up at their feet. He could hear the sound of voices, the clatter of cups, the distant hum of a radio playing a song he didn't recognize. But it was all just background noise. All that mattered was this moment. The human exhaled, staring out the window. "Guess we have a lot to figure out," they murmured, fingers tapping idly against the tabletop. "Not that I mind. It's just been a while since I had someone else to think about." Max's ears flicked. He didn't know what they meant, but he knew the sound of loneliness when he heard it. He had carried it himself for far too long. The human smiled faintly, glancing down at him. "But I think I like having you around." Max's tail thumped lightly against the floor. Yeah, he thought he liked it too. A home again. The next few weeks passed in a blur of quiet moments and small steps forward. The human had a home, not a big one, not like the places Max barely remembered from his past, but it was warm, and it smelled like them. That was all that mattered. At first, Max was hesitant. He had spent so long surviving on the streets that the concept of walls, of a roof over his head, felt foreign. The first night, he had curled up near the door, unable to shake the instinct that he might need to run. But the human didn't try to move him. They didn't force him into a bed, didn't tell him where he should go. They simply let him be. And over time, slowly, he began to trust. He started sleeping closer, first near the couch, then beside their bed. He let himself relax when they were home, let himself believe that he wouldn't wake up to find it all gone. Some nights, when the world outside was quiet and the city lights cast soft shadows against the walls, the human would reach down, resting their fingers gently against his fur. And Max would close his eyes, feeling something he had not known in so long. Peace. A new beginning. One morning, the human stood in the doorway, holding something small in their hands. The collar. Max stared at it, ears twitching. It was the same one they had left for him on the blanket, the one he had never dared to touch. The human didn't move toward him. They simply knelt, placing it on the floor between them. "I won't make you," they said softly, "but I'd like you to have it." Max hesitated. He had worn a collar once, a lifetime ago. It had meant belonging, had meant being part of something, until it hadn't. Until he had been left behind, collar and all, abandoned in the cold. But this was different, because this time it wasn't being forced on him. This time it was his choice. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped forward. His nose brushed against the worn leather, the scent of it mixing with the familiar warmth of the human. Then, with quiet acceptance, he let them fasten it around his neck. The human exhaled, their smile small but real. "There," they murmured, scratching lightly behind his ear. "Now you're really mine." Max closed his eyes, pressing into the touch. Number not theirs. They were his too. And for the first time in so long, he was home. Final moments. The seasons changed. The city remained the same, but the world felt different now, lighter, warmer. Max spent his days at the human's side. They took walks together, shared quiet moments in the park, sat in front of the small cafe where it had all started. The past still lingered, in memories and faint echoes of hunger, but it no longer defined him. He had been astray. He had been forgotten, but not anymore. Because, in the end, love had found him again. And this time, it wasn't leaving. Not all stories of abandoned animals end like Max's. Every day, thousands of dogs are left behind, waiting for someone to see them, to give them a second chance. If you ever find yourself with the opportunity to help, whether it's through adoption, fostering, or simply spreading awareness, take it. Because sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change a life forever. What would you have done if you had seen Max in the rain? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart.